Hello and welcome to Exploring the Politisphere with me, your host, the British Knight, and my guest for this evening, Yizz the Eunuch. How are you?
I'm well, sir. And yourself?
I am absolutely fantastic, thank you very much. So, for those of
Glad to
you...
hear that.
Pardon?
I said glad to hear that.
Oh, thank you very much. So, for those of you who are new to the stream, this is a interview stream where I ask the guests questions so we can get to know them a little better. Usually the guests are relating to our political YouTubers or people who run parallel to them, and very occasionally we might get people who are in the actual realm of politics, like our guest last week. But for this evening we have the Yizz the Eunuch, and we hope it's going to be a good and informative stream. So if our guest is ready, we'll get into the first question.
I am ready to roll, my friend. I've got my vape. I've got my Mountain Dew. I am ready to go.
Fantastic. Okay, so first question. How did you first become aware of political YouTube?
Political YouTube was something that I stumbled into maybe 6 years ago. I have always been interested in philosophy, the why behind things, why people do what they do because of my unique background. And I also like learning how the world works and history and stuff. So ever since the holy trinity of the information age sort of rose to prevalence, and of course by that I mean Google, YouTube, and Wikipedia, I've always lost myself to wiki chains and interesting videos on history and that kind of thing. And it was the thing that really pulled me into YouTube was about 2014 when I started being interested in what was going on with feminism and what back at the time what I called social justice activism before I learned better words to call it. And that's what pulled me in because I lived in a big city out west for about a decade. And I noticed just how crazy and weird people were getting around me about the most obtuse and bizarre, unrealistic things. And I noticed that even back then, 6 and 7 years ago, it was already becoming socially dangerous to talk about certain things without being branded a heretic or thrown off the island. And that's what led me to sort of trying to find avenues of explanation and find like-minded people. That's what led me here.
So it was very much a journey that started off as something a bit more personal, but ended up leading you to meeting other like-minded people via the internet, or more specifically YouTube.
Mm-hmm, definitely.
Oh, fantastic. I have much a very similar story. Like, I started out just trying to find out more information, and I kind of really stumbled into political YouTube. I've told this story on this stream before, where like I kind of just stumbled into the whole like feminist argument. So more specifically for me, it was after the 2017 general election, where
The one just following the Brexit referendum, correct?
yeah, I originally, because of the family I grew up in a family of like social democrat. Essentially, my mum and dad were both social democrats. My granddad was a socialist. And so essentially I grew up with this sort of working class mentality that like being a right winger is just like it's an inherent bad. So like it's just
That was after I left the area I grew up in, which was a very right-wing libertarian Christian area in the Appalachian Mountains of well, we say Appalachian, but it's supposedly technically the right way to say it's Appalachian, but whatever. I grew up in a rural area that was mostly all old-timey white Christian folks, so it might as well have been 1940 where I grew up. But outside of that area, when I moved away for college and then went to a big city out west and then visited other large cities out west, it was like anything that wasn't Stalin or further left was considered to be a moral failing and a moral wrong, which was always strange to me because I always considered myself right-leaning and libertarian-leaning, and back then I just assumed libertarian meant right-wing because all the examples I had to read about leftism in encyclopedias and history books seemed rather big government authoritarian to me, so I just assumed I was naturally opposed to that. So it was a very uncomfortable thing going through my 20s, having to learn that the way I naturally was and the way that I thought America was supposed to be, everybody around me considered to be morally wrong. It was a very strange awakening.
for me it was very much a case of I guess you could say figuring myself out, because I got into this whole culture war thing fairly young. Like, I'm only 22 now.
Well, I'm getting close to 41, so I'm a bit older than you.
Yeah,
About twice your age.
yeah. I got into this whole thing fairly young, so I was trying to. So I kind of got engaged in the culture war just as I was trying to, I guess you could say, figure myself out politically, and I think it was probably for the best, because at the end of the day, I. It was basically through the culture war itself that I was, and through a lot of the people who were kind of discussing what was going wrong with the, like, essentially with the modern world and modern politics, that was able to essentially push me in the, it essentially pushed me in the direction of, like, liberty and freedom, and, you know, like, understanding, I guess you could say, understanding power and its corrupting influence.
Yeah, definitely. And wealth equaling power at a certain level was something I started to see the evils in, because remember, me being about twice your age, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, where the counterculture at the time was you hate the rich conservatives, the big corporate fat cats were the villains in the movies, that kind of thing. And it wasn't until many years later that the SJWs or leftists or communists or whatever were even something in American culture that sort of became noticeable. It was all sort of subtle then, unless you went to university or whatever. So it took me several years into my 20s to even realize that we had an endemic Marxist leftist problem in America, because it took me until then to even notice that it was around me.
Yeah, with me, it's always been the fact that by the time I kind of got developed a unique political position on my own, I kind of realised that everyone around me was kind of just passively, like, even if they weren't actively engaged in politics, and like the sort of people who you would say, who you'd ask them about politics and say, oh, it's all the same. Like, it's that kind of disengaged. They were all kind of passively left wing, if you like. Like,
Yeah, most of the people I met in America are like that too. They just seem to think that they're left wing even if they're not, and that's how endemic the ever leftward drift of the Overton window is. It seemed like regular Americans, that when I actually would sit down and make them talk to me, had right wing conservative values and or libertarian values, still considered themselves left wing. It's like they didn't know what the words meant. So I think that's proof of how powerful the ones that control the window actually are.
yeah, it's I think it's somewhat unique in the UK's case, but I very nearly did, like, I will openly admit this, I very nearly did drift into the more, shall we say, authoritarian aspects of the right wing as I started to get a bit black-pilled, maybe about 18 months, 2 years ago. But I think...
Well, I've been consorting with them for years, but I've never been one myself. But I do understand where a lot of people, I understand the sentiment that a lot of people of the, whatever you want to call this, the dissident right, the far right, whatever the media wants to slander us as. I understand why a lot of people sort of romanticize the Third Reich and authoritarian rightism, is because they feel so victimized and oppressed and cast out as outcasts and monsters. They finally get sick of it, and it's like, well, you know what? Fine, I'll be the damn monster. I'll be the right-wing boogeyman you want me to be. I'm sick of it. And I think that's what leads a lot of, especially young men, down that path.
But I guess a lot of the... it also helped that... I guess you could say that a lot of the big cultural figures of both, like, sort of traditionalism and like adherence to actual proper right-wing thought were actually, quite a lot of them in our history were actually women. Like, at least in recent history, like, easily the most well-liked monarch of the last 500 years is the current monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, and
She does seem to be rather well liked.
yeah, she's probably one of the few remaining unifying figures in British culture, and also one of the, I guess you could say, the last truly right-wing person of any kind of true political power in the UK was, of course, Margaret Thatcher. So, I guess it helps that there's always this balancing factor where in at least in UK culture for me, that has kept me grounded into essentially leaning too far into this whole, like, I guess you could say, absolutist
Hmm.
thought of, like, you know, like, essentially, like, thinking in absolute terms rather than accepting exceptions to the rule, kind of like the like, in terms of, say, traditionalism, saying, like women should only adhere to certain gender roles or whatever. And, like, while I do certainly believe that that is the case for most, I do think that the exceptions should be allowed to be exceptional, if you like.
Yeah, that's if you it would allow me to pontificate a little bit about that. I don't like a lot of things about democracy. I don't like a lot of things about the path that free market liberalism, libertarianism has led us because of how it's been co-opted by people who reject those values and use them against people. And one of the big problems that I have with what in America they call the civil rights movement, women getting to vote, blacks getting to vote, people that aren't white getting equal treatment under the law, all of those things are good. I think those are good values. I don't think that we should use state legislation to say people of certain sex or racial traits are less than human. I think that's ugly and wrong. I think pretty much everyone here can agree on that. But when it comes to voting rights, well, the right to exist and the right to pursue your religion and your happiness is different from who you agree should have ability to shape your governance. And I think that somewhere along the line, the left has sort of won the culture war by making it an original sin if you think that those things are even up for debate anymore. And this is where I get into a lot of trouble with people that are sort of English liberal and libertarian is I think that we need to have a serious redesign and discussion about who can vote and what counts as rights these days. Because when you look at it, I don't think that a man or a woman should be precluded from allowing to pursue business, from allowing to pursue an academic career based on being a man or a woman. But I don't think that every Tom, Dick, and Harry and everyone who comes to this country and gets even the simplest type of citizenship should have a vote in governance and have a vote in how my tax money gets used. I hate that. I think that's wrong, and I think that that just opens the floodgates to a tyranny of the majority over the productive minority. So I would like to see some kind of change that's a hybrid of the cultural revolution that we've had that has brought about civil liberties and rights that I ethically agree with, but make some kind of governmental change going back 100 years to where only net contributors to society, only landowners, only those that contribute through charity or public works should be allowed to have a vote or a say in governance. So, and I think that that would be a good way to have our cake and eat it too, because we have rights and we give people the equality at the beginning to say, okay, you're black, you're Muslim, you're whatever, that's fine. You have carte blanche to participate, but everything is meritocratic and you have to prove yourself. You have to be invested in this area. You have to be productive. You have to not be on the dole and not take handouts and not do A, B, C, D, and E if you want to have a vote in how our tax money from the productive people is spent.
Well,
what do you think about that?
I think what a lot of people don't actually realise is that even going back to, like, classical liberals, which I used to be, I'm more of a minarchist these days. Even going back to classical liberals, like in the 19th century, they didn't believe in like universal suffrage. Universal suffrage was a fringe radical belief that even most women didn't believe in.
Right, exactly. It took a Marxist push in America to even get women to start to agree to it.
Like,
It actually started, I believe it started in before the Weimar Republic. There were already left-leaning authors that became, God, I can't remember their names because I'm bad at remembering names, especially ones that aren't very English. I forget the writer, but I think it was in the aughts or the teens was where the writing came about women having equal say in governance and military and stuff that became incorporated into the Soviet Union later. But the ideas definitely came from some kind of leftism, if not direct Marxism itself.
I guess it's just this. I just think that like the point I'm ultimately trying to make is that universal suffrage up until about 100 years ago was just something that even liberals just thought was it basically I would say is probably the original positive right, if you know what I mean. Now, for those of you who don't know, the difference between negative and positive rights is negative rights are essentially rights that should not be infringed on by government. They are what a classical liberal or libertarian would consider the only things they would actually consider rights. Whereas positive rights are essentially arbitrarily assigned concepts which are given the title of right, but need to be enforced by government.
Right, and I don't think that a positive right necessarily has to violate the NAP, because if you're talking about things like a right to vote, that only obtusely violates the NAP, because you're giving someone the right to have a say with how someone's money works that is taken by force. So it's not exactly a positive right in the way I would think of it, like government, universal health care, universal housing, that kind of thing. But it's definitely in the ballpark.
Oh yeah, it was the original positive right, and it kind of opened the floodgates for essentially the language, ultimately the language of the word right to start being used for other stuff like right to healthcare, like trans, even stuff is like we hear every day now, like trans rights are women's rights, etc., etc. Like that
and
language...
those are actually positive rights too, because when they talk about that stuff, what they're saying is you are no longer allowed to discriminate in your church. You're no longer allowed to discriminate at your private school. You're no longer allowed to discriminate A, B, C, D, E, even at your place of business. And in a way, that becomes a positive right, because you're forcing me to do things with my time and money that I don't want to do. And I think that's wrong.
Well, yeah, that ultimately that is where positive rights come into direct conflict with negative rights, because it is, to use your example of association and discrimination, the right to associate, the freedom of association, which is a negative right, also necessitates in its purest form freedom to discriminate, because if you have the freedom to associate, that also means by extension you have the freedom to disassociate.
Right.
And if
exactly.
And if you're going to disassociate with someone over another, that's discrimination. But
and a good example of this is the hypocrisy we see now about having to wear masks at businesses. If you remember, in America just a few years ago, there was the baker and the gay couple debacle that turned into the meme "Bake the Cake, Bigot." Well, now we have the exact opposite of that, where they say, well, if you don't wear a mask, we don't have to serve you. But in essence, that's just a flip-flop of the exact same principle as the Christian baker that didn't want to specifically custom make a gay wedding cake. It's just the reverse of that, but that's yet again more hypocrisy of this ridiculous leftism that we see.
See, weirdly enough, we actually had an example. We actually had an equivalent version of the gay cake situation here in the UK. Specifically in Northern Ireland, there was a example of essentially a baker turning down a gay couple because in Northern Ireland they tend to be particularly religious.
Catholic, right?
Both along Catholic and Protestant lines.
So it's still both? Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know much about how Ireland shook out, sorry.
Yeah, it's basically the Good Friday... To make it brief, Good Friday Agreement essentially made it so Northern Ireland is still part of the UK, but Northern Irish people can, upon adulthood, choose either UK or Irish citizenship, depending on their preference. So there is a fairly even mix of Catholics and Protestants there, but both groups tend to be very religious, and so both groups tend to be, and so I guess you could say the more fundamentalist among them tend to be fairly anti-LGBT, and so that resulted in a very similar situation. Not violent, not like horrible or mean-spirited. It was just a denial of service in a bakery to a gay couple, along the same lines as in America. And I have to say,
I'd like to point out, in America, the Christian man didn't deny them service. He denied their offer to make a custom cake.
Oh yeah,
he offered his standard services that he would offer anyone, and that's what makes this, in my opinion, egregious that he was so attacked for it. Is all he said was, I don't want to use my artistic talent to do something that's against my ethics, but I'll gladly give you business and you can buy my regular cakes and all the other stuff that I offer regularly.
Yeah, well, it was essentially the same situation here in the UK, but essentially that's what fairly convinced me, along with the fact that they have looser gun rights and everything, that Northern Ireland is probably the last bastion of sanity here in the UK, because it, against all odds, was actually held up in the Baker's favour, which you wouldn't think anywhere else in the UK, particularly London, would be the case, but against all the odds, his religious freedom was upheld, and I do think overall that kind of freedom to discriminate is an aspect of freedom of association, and thus must be upheld.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's anything that can be like, ultimately, I think it's cheap to say, oh yeah, freedom of association, but then when someone says, I don't want to be around that person for X reason, even if you find that reason to be, well, I guess you could say stupid or mean-spirited or racist or whatever, like, even if it was some, like, alt-right, Nazi, whatever, say, I don't want to be around Jews because I find them to be evil, greedy, etc., etc., etc. Pejoratives. They could just say, like, you can just, like, ultimately, it is the onus of the principled person to say, well, okay, as long as you don't hurt them, okay,
right?
Because that is ultimately freedom of association does include the freedom to discriminate. Just as long as that discrimination doesn't involve infringing on their rights.
And related to this is the egregious misusage of a couple of things by the cathedral, by leftists today, is they say that freedom of speech is not freedom from consequences, which I'll get to in a second, and that freedom of speech should not apply to hate speech or violent speech. Which, first, I'd like to address the second point first, because it's the simpler of the two. The freedom of speech concept only is necessary for unpopular, gross, and egregious speech. Otherwise, it's accepted anyway. So that's the fallacy number one, the hypocrisy number one. And the other problem is the freedom from consequences line that you see a lot. Well, freedom from consequences is not something that I believe is possible, first of all. And, like, to use your example earlier of someone who hates because of race or religion or whatever, that person should have the right to do so and not be punished by the law, and to not be carte blanche denied basic services and opportunity. But at the same time, the consequences of someone who is open about certain disdains or certain egregious personal habits, I do think that socially that person will have consequences, such as if I know someone is an open loudmouth about feminism or I don't know what you want to call it, racial identitarianism or whatever, I probably would opt to hire or associate with people who aren't like that and are less socially egregious, and that sort of just naturally sorts itself out. But the way that our enemies view that today is, well, if you say a naughty word that I think is hate speech, then that I am now justified to ruin your life, get you fired, and make it to where you can't feed your family. They're basically saying, if I think that you are theoretically bad, I have carte blanche to eliminate you from society and make you starve to death or die. And that's where I think we have gone completely off the rails with the Overton window lately.
Yeah, it ultimately culminated here in the UK with I think, like, a story that was released about a year ago, I think now, if not 18 months ago, where basically said that if doctors are racially abused. Now, keeping in mind, this doesn't mean physical abuse, this just means words. If a doctor or a nurse is racially abused, they can deny healthcare, despite having taken the Hippocratic Oath, to a patient.
Yeah, I remember reading about that and seeing some people make videos on it. That is just, again, off the deep end lunacy. That is not at all in line with the values and the... I know you don't have a constitution in England, but you have sort of an effective living constitution. It's against the constitutional nature of the makeup of our society to do those things.
Yeah, we have what's known as a discodified constitution, where essentially all our laws are technically part of our constitution. And and we have what's known as, I guess, as implied repeal, where essentially if a new law contradicts an old law, then the new law ultimately takes precedence over the old law. Which is why a lot of our, I guess you could say, our more egregious medieval laws are no longer in effect, because even if they weren't actively repealed, because they have been overwritten by newer laws.
Yeah.
For example, the rather humorous by modern standards law that Jews are not allowed to buy mail armor, as opposed to, like, according to the Assizes of Arms 1181 and 1252.
I remember that coming up the other day. Did that come up on your last stream or another stream? I forgot. But that came up recently.
Yeah, it was the last stream, yeah.
Yeah, I remember laughing when I heard that. I was like, wow. Imagine somebody coming out and saying that today, like, oh, well, we're not going to allow blacks or Jews to purchase internet connection because we think that's evil and wrong and they don't deserve it. Like, just imagine how that would fly today.
Yeah. It's essentially, it's that kind of, it's when you have a discodified constitution, that kind of implied repeal is necessary. Otherwise, your laws just become hopelessly muddled and self-contradictory, and it would also lead to a lot of miscarriage of justice where criminals can get away on like ancient technicalities.
Do you want to move to another question for me, or do you want me to move on to something?
Yeah, we'll move on to the next question. What made you want to get involved in political YouTube?
Well, between 2 and 4 years ago, I started losing everything because of this leftist encroachment on everything in my city. I did a lot of activism not activism, that's the wrong way. I did a lot of volunteer work. I'm intersex, and I've struggled with gender problems, and when I say sexual problems, I don't mean performance. I mean sex cells and genetic problems along hormone lines for most of my life. Yeah. And so I've been loosely involved with trans activism and trans healthcare since I was young. And as much as the trans lobby wanted to co-opt me and quote-unquote make me a tranny that they could use, I resisted it. And I tried to be my own person and stay within as naturally aligned with my mutant biology as I could and not try to go down the tranny path. And in doing so, I learned a lot about medicine and insurance and science and healthcare and how corporations and government look at people that are different like me that have gender struggles and sex identity problems. And so for many years, I volunteered to be on panels, to go to medical seminars, and to share my story and share what I've observed. Because out west, especially in America, a lot of companies, they invite activist groups or charity groups to come and talk about minority problems. And so because I was rubbing shoulders with people that were like that, I was naturally associated with a lot of who were to become the dangerous far leftist element. And I started losing my friends and family because starting around 4.5, 5 years ago, right around the beginning of the Trump campaign stuff, there was an overall witch hunt for anyone who wasn't going to bow down and suck the dick of the diversity goddess and prostrate oneself on the altar of leftism. And of course, I never will do that. And once my philosophical and political persuasion started being known, I was attacked. I was smeared. People would make up sexual abuse stories about me. People would send emails to a college saying that I did A, B, C, D, and E behind closed doors. Sometimes when I wasn't even at the seminar, they were saying that I did horrible things at. So that started causing me severe problems. Then I lost one of my jobs. I had 2. Then I started having trouble getting work because people would actively campaign to slander me to everyone that they knew, because I worked in a particular field connected to medicines and universities. So basically I became blacklisted to everyone. And then people who knew me personally even started shunning me. So over the course of the 2015 to 2018, I basically lost everything and then started getting subtle threats, which turned into active threats. And so I just decided to abandon the city that I lived in. And that's what led me to living back in the Appalachian Mountains where I am now. And that, starting about a little over 2 years ago, is what made me wanted to start becoming active and putting my voice out there, because I knew that there must be other people out there that if they weren't like me genetically or with sex and gender problems, there were at least be a lot of people like me because of the goodness of their heart and a desire to make things better in the world around them. They will have been going up against this same terrible leftist meat grinder that I've been having to go up against. And I thought that maybe I could find some peace and some solace in others. And so I began my channel 2 years ago with the first video, and where I said I want to explore what the concept of liberty and justice for all actually means. And that's sort of where I started, because I'm assuming that you know liberty and justice for all is an old iconic American phrase.
Yeah.
And that's sort of what led me to where I am today, exploring the political sphere, exploring nationalism, exploring the difference between civic and ethno-nationalism, exploring what the problems between gender that we have today, racial struggles we have today, the constant problems we're having with mass migration, the bloated capitalism problems, neocon, neolibs, that kind of thing. I've delved into all of those things in the last 2 years, listening to what everyone has to say, from the far left to the far right and up, down, and in between, giving people a chance to talk and be heard, and learning from them what I can. So that's what led me to where I am today.
See, I find that really interesting because I think I don't mean to sound patronising, but the struggle of the intersex person, it's something that's very unique because it's something you don't really hear about very often. You hear about trans people a lot, you hear about gay people, lesbians, bisexuals like myself. You hear about that all the time because it's very mainstream now, but intersex outside of the kind of la-di-da, like fake, I guess you could say fake intersex non-binary stuff.
Well,
it's not really
I'd like
discussed.
to speak on that a little bit. Intersex is a concept that lives outside of medicine because going back 20 years ago, there were many people in LGBT activism and LGBT communities that liked the concept of intersex, and they wanted to implement that instead of the trans or transgender label, because many people that were feminine males, many people that were masculine females, people that identified as dyke or fairy or twink, those kind of words that are kind of gender wiggly already, they liked the phrase intersex because the transsexual and transgender language, even going back to the 90s, it meant a very hard-lined one to the other concept that most of us didn't like. And so many people that were not medically intersex pushed for the usage of the word intersex to mean, hey, we have this group, this cluster of people who are fine existing in the middle as we are, without medical intervention, without having to get on this crazy new tranny bandwagon to where we have to get surgery and hormone shots and all this other crazy stuff. We're fine how we are, being gender weird the way we are, and we need sort of a flag or a banner for that. And that's how intersex started being used in America about 30 years ago for that. It doesn't necessarily always mean people like me that have clinical intersex conditions, although medically that is all it means. But I want you to know that there is at least some actual legs and value of people who want to use the phrase intersex in a more LGBT way, because I experienced that growing up, going to the first college I went to and making friends where I did.
Oh, I imagine there is. I'm simply to ask a fairly related question. Do you think that kind of distinction between the, I guess you could call it the ideological or sexual orientation based kind of intersex and the medical intersex, do you think that might skew the statistics on people who are born intersex, or is that entirely medical in nature?
Here's yes and no. When you're talking about statistics, people who are intersex like me are so rare, we are usually not counted among statistics other than intersex births, because intersex genetics is about 1 out of 400 people, 3 to 400 people. Excuse me. Gonadular intersex people like me are about 1 out of 1,000. Hermaphroditic intersex people, which means having a noticeable twinning of presented genitalia, is even rarer still, only 1 out of about every 1,800 to 2,000 births. Most of us, of all types, we do not have the medical problems that lead to what I had, because in the modern era, these things are noticed young, usually in the first week of birth or before the child's even a year old, and the parents get proper medical attention. They get them fixed, they get them spayed or neutered like a dog, and then they give them quote-unquote vitamin shots, which are really hormone sculpting shots to help usher in a proper puberty at the right age. If any of you went to school with kids that had to get regular hormone or vitamin shots, they might have been intersex, and their parents might have been giving them hormone shots and then tell them when they're older, when it's puberty time, why their genitalia might look a little different or why they might feel a little funny when they're going through puberty. That's how most of us get handled that have my condition. I had ridiculously orthodox and traditional religious parents who refused all medical help, and they didn't tell me I had this condition, and I didn't learn about it until I was late in my teens. I also had an abusive father and other ugly stuff I don't want to talk about. I didn't have the best youth. But people like me who don't get the medical treatment that intersex people are quote unquote supposed to have, they often end up in the bucket that I'm in. And we are lumped into the transgender umbrella cluster because the movement in the 80s and 90s to not that fought against, I mean, that we are included because we lost. We lost the culture war against the ever widening transgender umbrella fueled by the LGBT Marxists that want to forcefully incorporate everyone different into their army. So we don't even get counted as our own statistic when it comes to anything having to do with academia, because anyone who's different and vocal about it immediately gets shoved in the transgender umbrella, which becomes, you know, whether you want it or not, you have to wear the Che Guevara beret for the LGBT army. So we don't even have an identity outside of a medical statistic based around birth, based around obvious genetics at birth.
See, that's the kind of thing. I hear a similar argument being made by the likes of, I guess you could call them medical absolutists, like say Rose of Dawn, who.
Well, I'm that too, by the way.
Yeah, medical absolutists who kind of say that there's a lot of people who are being put under the trans umbrella who aren't necessarily trans. And and trans has a very specific definition, which is being deliberately skewed in modern times. Like you said, going back to the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, and also working in nursing and volunteering like I did many 4.5, 5 years of donating my time doing nursing and counseling for queer youth and trans youth. This was out west, of course, where there was a big market for that. And most of the people that came to us were between 15 and 25. And almost all of them were not transsexual. And this word transgender is a word that sort of just, in my opinion, the word transgender was dreamed up by activists. It's not really a thing that people that actually deal with trans people use. It's sort of a new thing that they have to use now because of the politics of it. Only about 1 out of 20 or 25 people that me in the clinic would counsel and help were actually trans. Most of them came with their heads full of trans nonsense and gender problems because of what they learned on TV, because of what they've been told by other queer people that were indoctrinated into this LGBT Marxism. And almost none of the people that came through our clinic were genuinely trans once we identified their problems and helped them. And yet, so many of them, by the time they even got to me, were holding a prescription for hormone therapy. And it was just madness trying to live and exist in this system where doctors and counselors and psychiatrists and professors from universities and police officers and parents are all filling these kids' heads full of these awful lies about gender, these lies about what it is to be trans. And and they get to me and I have to try to unpack that. And then I get called the gatekeeper. I get called a bigot for wanting to try to not put these people on a path they shouldn't be on and save them from the dangers and the risks and the problems of being a transsexual person. It was really hard for me having to see that people like me were being forced out of volunteer work, being forced out of medicine and counseling, where we actually needed to be to help people that had real emotional and real problems in life. But instead of helping them with real, genuine help, they're just giving them hormones and filling their heads full of lies to add another number to the transgender army bucket. And it was sickening and infuriating. And like I said, I eventually had to leave all of that because me and my family were just going to get attacked and maybe even have our house burned down or something if I kept on pushing the way I was. So we just had to leave. And so it's sad, but I know that I rambled and moved away from what I was supposed to answer, but it's still sort of a fresh wound for me because we only moved away from that 2 years ago.
No, I absolutely understand what you like. Well, I can't really claim to understand, but I absolutely empathise with what you're talking about. I guess you could say that it kind of correlates with things we've heard in other areas, such as a lot of autistic kids, especially girls, are essentially being brought into the.
The reason there's an overlap with transgenderism these days and autism is people that are on an autism spectrum. It is seemingly the autistic spectrum has been broadened to mean people that have a lot of socializing problems, to people that maybe are even minorly Asperger's or are considered autistic now. And gender gender is a learned behavior because of your natural sexual traits. Gender is as much a part of sex as race is a part of ethnicity and nationalism. You can't ever separate the two, even though it's not the whole truth and the whole story. People that are autistic or struggle with socializing and understanding what socializing around them is supposed to mean to them and how they're supposed to adapt, they have gender identity problems. This is unavoidable. And if you have a gender problem, like not understanding a sexuality, not really understanding what it means to be a woman, well, the reason we have a lot of that today is because the Marxists and the feminists have been destroying gender norms and making men and women hate each other for 80 years. So you have mountains of young girls who are poorly socialized with their parents and their parents' parents and everything they see on TV being through this lens of a crazy feminist gender war of postmodernism. So they have all that stacked against them, plus peer pressure of being cool or being part of the victim group or all this other nonsense that's being pushed today. And then you get all of these young females coming into your clinic that think they're trans or think they want to be a man or think they hate being a woman because they don't have any fucking clue what being a healthy, societally sculpted man or woman is, because their parents haven't showed them, TV hasn't showed them, church hasn't shown them, and it's madness. And then you've got these people that are the ideological LGBT activist Marxist people who want them to be victims forever, who want them to be self-loathing, familyless, husbandless, childless messes, because then the only place they have to turn is the LGBT army. And that's what I think this is all about. It's this collectivist, bizarre victimhood mentality that's being weaponized by those who are the enemies of the West, we'll just say.
Yeah, it's this idea that they need to give themselves up to the whole. No, there's no need for them to understand who they are as individuals and, to better themselves as individuals and allow them and essentially create the conditions through which they can live the best, happiest, most prosperous life possible. Like, ultimately, they must give themselves up to the whole, which in their case is the Marxist wing of the LGBT quote-unquote community. I don't really like using that term, but, it helps.
I don't have a better term for it, or I would use it.
Yeah, it helps linguistically, but otherwise I don't really like using it, because LGBT is an arbitrary qualifier. It's not really a community in the actual sense.
Well, I say LGBT like I would say Soviet or not. It's a particular ideology under a particular flag that bespeaks to a particular set of social mores and goals.
Yeah.
So when I say LGBT, I mean the political activist, Church of Woke intersectional feminism cluster that allies under the LGBT banner for political activism. When I say LGBT, that's what I mean.
Yeah, I get, like, on a slightly unrelated note, I think it's very easy to tell when something has become, I guess you could say, ideologized, if you like, is when it has a flag. Because you don't need to fly a flag unless you're looking to... You don't need to fly a flag unless you're looking to rally people under a common banner.
Well, I would even go further than that and say you don't need a flag unless you stake your own territory and claim it. Yeah,
like, the Union, like, let's take the British Empire, for example. The Union Jack is it's inseparable from the British Empire because it is flown specifically to show, hey, this belongs to Britain. Like, and, like, if you're flying, and to apply that to the LGBT, like, if you're flying that flag, this goes, hey, like, this area is pro-LGBT. If you speak otherwise, you will be excommunicated.
Well, I mean, that's taking a territory, even if it's a social one.
Well, that's what I mean. It's ultimately this idea that you're essentially putting out a set of... You're essentially declaring a set of intentions and norms via what is associated with the flag, I suppose.
Yeah.
And LGBT is no exception. And yes, Vex is 80. Rule Brit Bongia. Yes.
Hi, Vex.
Brit Bongia rules the waves, etc., etc. Do you feel you've made an impact with your channel?
Yes. Yes, I do.
In what regard?
I feel like I have made an impact because I have met several LGBT previous LGBT people who have been thrown off the island or left willingly that I have made a great deal of impact with. I've had, I would say, between 40 and 50 message me in the last couple of years that I didn't know previously, that were either gay men or gay women, some kind of intersex or trans person, that said what I have done and what I have been vocal about has helped them tremendously to know not just that they're not alone, but have the correct language and words to speak about it to others, just to even know how to say it. And that means a lot to me. And I have even more impact doing the recent activism I've been doing for like the last 8 months, helping people break away of this potent, strong, anti-white, anti-Western sentiment that's been cropping up. Because even at the end of last year, before COVID, before these awful race riots, there was already a tremendous push in America and in the UK where there was a diversity push, more diversity officers being hired, people that were white or male or Christian being replaced in record numbers, being pushed out of the Politisphere, pushed out of academia. Go back a few years to the Evergreen College fiasco. Every few months, there's another horrible video coming out of a British or an American university of just gangs of non-whites and a few contentious whites among them making these egregious, ridiculous demands like white people aren't allowed to come to the campus for the next 3 days, or we want to create no white spaces on campus, shouting down people that are deans or professors with tenure just for saying, no, I'm not letting you have A, B, C, D, and E because you're making ridiculous demands. They get called racist. They get called being all these other horrible names. And then the universities side with the idiot students and they fire them. It's a ridiculous sentiment that I see leading down the path to where South Africa is now.
Yeah,
and I've been trying to stop it. And I think that my activism hinges on breaking the onus, breaking the shackles of white guilt. Because all of this right now that we're seeing with this racial contention is because Western whites, already of Christian values, already of the European values of charity and helping others and wanting to take our ways and our spirit of goodness to others and help uplift people, those values are being exploited against us now on a racial level. And from the time you're a child, you're brought up being told that anyone who cares about being white or says being white is good is a Nazi villain, and that's evil and wrong. Meanwhile, even on your own soil, people who aren't white are actively encouraged to do exactly the same thing. And that has created this awful miasma of racial tension and white self-loathing. And I'm trying to cripple that and break that, because I feel like if I break the onus of white guilt in the West, we will not have to have a race war. We won't have to have a lot of the awful problems that we're headed towards. And that's why I've been so vocal with pushing the terminology anti-white and anti-whiteism, which you use just like anti-Semite and anti-Semitism, because the word racist and racism has always meant a negative thing in our society, because it was designed to do that by Trotsky 100 years ago. So that's why I don't use racist anymore. And now I'm actually pushing the meme no white guilt, because that's an excellent mimetic response to Black Lives Matter. You can say white lives matter, but that means you're being an obvious contentious asshole. But if you say no white guilt, that means you're not going to guilt me, but I'm not saying black lives don't matter. Obviously all lives matter because I'm a Westerner and I'm not a prick, but I'm not going to have white guilt. We're not going to have white guilt. You shouldn't have black guilt. You shouldn't have Arab guilt. Nobody should have guilt for the sins of their forefathers. Nobody should have guilt for anything they didn't do, even if it's contemporaneous. I'm not a police officer that brutalizes people. I'm not someone who exploits people in the... I shouldn't have any guilt about that, regardless of my inalienable traits, and neither should you. So that's why I think no white guilt is an excellent mimetic phrase to push to help save us from a terrible end, and help save us from things like the African National Convention and Marxism having such a stranglehold on South Africa right now.
Well, it's exactly what the same kind of idea that I have towards the Middle Eastern Muslims. It's this idea that because I hear a lot of, I guess you could call them British patriots, British nationalists, stuff like that. Like they'll say like, oh, Islam and the Middle East haven't changed in 1400 years. I'm like, if you actually look at the history, that's not necessarily true. The Middle East went through its own ideological enlightenment or renaissance, like before even Europe did. It was just where Europe kind of embraced its enlightenment fully. The Middle East got about part way through, and then its ideological leaders decided to do a U-turn because, like, where our clergy eventually learned to embrace the Enlightenment tradition and adapt to it, the clergy of the Middle East with Islam decided to subvert their Enlightenment, which kind of tells me that there is a taste for Enlightenment thinking and for, I guess you could say, development in the Middle East. It hasn't been fully ignited yet. And it can be, because to put this into, give a very, very brief history as to how our Enlightenment began. Essentially, our Enlightenment began with Thomas Aquinas. He was a medieval theologian and a philosopher. He learned, and basically a lot of his philosophy was based around the teachings of Aristotle. He learned it from a Jewish philosopher by the name of Averroes, and Averroes learned it from a Muslim philosopher of the late, towards the end of the Arab Enlightenment, called Maimonides. And so it's not too untrue to say that without the Arabic Enlightenment, we would not have had the European Enlightenment. I do believe we would have had it, but we wouldn't have had it until much later on, had it not been for the philosophers of the Middle East and of Judea. But where we managed to carry it all the way through, the Middle East kind of stopped halfway through because the clergy got a bit nervous about people starting to think for themselves. And which is kind of, and here's the thing, our clergy went through much the same process. They feared its how do I put this? Much like that, they feared they feared people starting to think for themselves and starting to develop their own ideas, like in philosophy and like theocracy and stuff like that. But I guess you could say that overall, I think people just, like, using this your example and my example of like the Middle East, people just need to, like, there is a taste for enlightenment and for people thinking for themselves and developing new innovative ideas while still sticking to the roots of their philosophy and of their culture. And they don't necessarily have to come out exactly the same way. It's just, I think there is a, like, this embrace, an embrace of the truth over, like, an embrace of the truth over, I guess you could say, subjectiveness, or, like, I guess you could say just feelings over facts, to quote Ben Shapiro, will ultimately lead to a better tomorrow. But what we're seeing right now is a huge, like, I guess you could say, embracing of subjectivity and feelings over facts, like, which is ultimately led to a lot of the problems which both you and I described, both historically and today.
And I'd like to take a sort of philosophical approach to explaining why that is. You see, People that are heavily English liberal and classic liberal, they often speak against tribalism, against racial identitarianism. And the reason that's a fallacy is because of our genetics, we can never be free of those things. However, we can exist peacefully in spite of those things. And multiculturalism, Marxism, this awful, heartless, multinational, heedless capitalism that we have these days, these all make us shattered, empty, hollow. They remove what we have cultivated through enlightenment and make us all more debased. They make us dig down deeper into our primal roots. And what do we find? We find racial differences. We find religious differences. We find a need for tribalism to fill that pathological gap in our spirits. And that's why we're seeing so many things crop up that are problems we shouldn't be having right now. And that's because of this powerful anti-white narrative in the West, and then the anti-white clusters that call themselves Marxists and feminists and intersectionalists and globalists and all these other things. They are specifically driving more wedges into that spiritual gap that we have, pulling at these levers to turn us all against each other, to make us angry, to make us fight. And that's what we need to fix. I think that we need to have a healthy nourishment of nationalism, racial identity, religious identity, sex identity, gender identity, because look at the Victorian era. You can say what you want about the negative traits, but people were making peace with life and their station, and it gave birth to the greatest era of civilization that humanity has ever seen. Then what's happened in the last 80 years? Look at all the isms. Look at the jingoism. Look at the wars. Look at the poverties created in countries that should otherwise be rich. Look at the resource wars. All of these negative things. You can't pin it all on leftism. We have had a massive, massive blow to the spirituality of humanity. And I don't necessarily mean religion. I mean having a grounded feeling of connection to the people around you, to your forefathers, to the children that will come after you, to the homes you make, to the soil that you till with your hands. We have lost that as a people. And we need to get that back because we're crumbling. And the more that enlightenment and cultivation of spirit and purpose goes away, the faster we all run to the ugly darknesses of primal behavior that lay within us. And that's what I seek to end. I seek to bring that back in the West in a healthy way so we can avoid a race war, so we can avoid a class war. And I think that I can do it. And if we all can spread the right ideas without excising the ideas that we need, without trying to make us not human, then we can do it. So that's the spiritual why of what you.
Well,
opinion.
It's why I think there was a much great, like, you hear a lot of stories about how racist and how like xenophobic people were in like the colonial period and whatnot. But if you actually look into the history, it's not necessarily that true. You find
Correct.
that people are, yes, they might think of their culture as superior, both on the our side and on the side of the foreigners. But
cultural chauvinism isn't necessarily racism or violence against an ethnicity.
No, they just overall they just like obviously it's just in group preference, which is perfectly natural. But
and I wouldn't even go as far as to say that I'm a Western chauvinist. I don't think that my society is ultimately superior. I just think that my culture is for me. And I don't want it destroyed, and I don't want to be told that I shouldn't care about it, or else I'm some kind of anti-white slur. Just like I don't want to go to Ethiopia or India or Bangladesh and tell them, you have to live like the British, or you're doing it wrong. Like, I wouldn't ever think to do that. Just like I don't want people that are communists coming here to my right-wing libertarian nation and telling me I have to be a communist. Go be a communist somewhere else. This place isn't for you. This place is for me. That kind of thing.
Well, that's the thing. It's like, if you want to live in an authoritarian country, like, take your pick. There are a great many authoritarian countries in the world.
There are plenty of them, exactly.
Like,
don't live here. Go somewhere else.
Like, even modern Russia is like, it's a authoritarian oligarchy presenting itself as a democracy. Now, one could argue that. Yeah, one could argue that or one could argue that all democracies are like that, but Russia is like that to a much greater degree than any other democracy in the West, in that it doesn't really much care about hiding the fact. And this can be seen perfectly well in that communism is like, most people would think that communism would be something that would be hated in Russia after how all the effects that it had on the country, when in fact the Communist Party, even to this day, is the second biggest party in Russian democracy. It's still voted for far and wide, especially in like I guess you could say the far reaches of Russia, and like the eastern parts where it's less inhabitable. Communism is very much still widely voted for, even if it's in the overall minority
and even if it's by a different name, because if you look at a lot of the liberal parties or whatever nationalist parties or whatever have sprung up in Soviet satellite states or in South America, they don't say communism, but it's basically socialist big state communism, and that's what a lot of people vote for and want.
Yeah, like Russia, to use Russia specifically, like they actively call it the Communist Party, and I believe they get like something like 30% of the vote whenever there's an election. Like, as opposed,
maybe there's just a lot of people that are still scared to vote otherwise.
Yeah, whereas what are they called? For Russia, I believe. Like Putin's party.
I wouldn't know, friend. I wouldn't know.
Yeah, I believe they're called For Russia or Unite Russia or whatever. Well, they're the biggest party, but they're essentially just authoritarianism of the more right-wing traditionalist type, which I would say is, like, you can definitely tell my preference, but that you might call them I would say it's preferable, but only so much, I guess you could say. Like, but yeah, overall, if you want to live in a more authoritarian country and you want to live under the quote-unquote security of a if you want to live under a quote-unquote if you want to live under the quote-unquote security of a big government nation that doesn't really care about you, then take your pick. There are plenty. Like, go live there. Don't try and change our country to a place that doesn't reflect the values which have developed over the past 1,000 to 1,500 years in this part of the world.
Yeah. So, do you want me to move on from there, or do you have another question for me?
I have another question, of course. Are you optimistic about the future in political, social, or cultural terms?
Am I optimistic about the future of political or social what?
Are you optimistic about the future in political, social, or cultural terms?
Yes. Shall I elaborate?
Absolutely.
I am not hopeful that the system of governance nor the society that we know now is going to persist. But I am hopeful because I see so many people in the Anglosphere. Now, I don't know about the non-Anglosphere because I mostly focus on things I can understand and listen to, mostly in the Anglosphere. In America and in Britain specifically, there are so many people that are angry at how things are. And we're speaking, we're sharing, we're getting unified on myriad social media. I think that even if corporations fall and economies collapse, I think we are going to be better than we were. And I believe that we are going to break the onus of white guilt. I believe we're going to triumph over cultural Marxism. I believe we are going to replace crony capitalism with something better because the majority of people want it. And regardless of how much power the cathedral has, it wouldn't be pushing, it wouldn't be revealing itself, it wouldn't be becoming so dramatically visible unless it was on the ropes and knew that it had and that it was now or never. And I think that we are going to crush globalism, and I think that we are going to crush anti-whiteism. And it might be painful. We might have crashed economies, we might lose a lot of things that we're accustomed to, But I think that we're going to pull through, and I think we're going to build better.
Yeah, no, I would quite agree, considering that a large part of what makes a large part of why the current year is so censorious and so, I guess you could say, so violently against, like, a lot of the stuff that we're seeing right now can be partially attributed to the fact that people have been stuck in their homes for the past 3-4 months, but it can also be partially attributed to the fact that up until like maybe halfway through last year, like, we were so clearly winning, if you like people, like, there was like, up until like halfway through in 2019, there was no indication that the political left were gaining any kind of ground with the normies, that there was any kind of there was any kind of push, like, viable pushback against the stuff that we were trying to promote. And here's the thing, like, I don't actually believe that the coronavirus was a tactic by the powers that be in order to, I guess you could say, give them a way of pushing back. But if
I don't either.
but
I
if that,
believe the response to it was.
yeah, but if that turned out to be true, like, even if I don't believe it, even if that turned out to be true, I wouldn't be particularly surprised. Like, that's the way
I wouldn't be very surprised, but I don't believe that it was purposeful. I think that it was just regular negligence and a regular. You don't select the best people, you don't have the safest material, and you're handling dangerous level biomatter. And China already has a long history of people selling animals outside of these research facilities, and a long history of having rather lax and terrible security parameters. So I think that with Occam's razor here, something got out because of regular problems and regular negligence. There were certain overreactions by the Chinese, and I believe that Chinese meddling wanted to make it seem worse than it was, because they wanted to seem like they handled a miraculous recovery and fought against all odds to make themselves look better, like all authoritarian governments do, and made mountains out of molehills. And then you've got globalists like the Soros crew and the Bill Gates people that are just dying for an epidemic to push their agenda, jumped on the shit. And then you've got a bunch of idiot politicians in the Anglosphere who were like, oh no, we got to take care of people, and we're going to push this agenda, and we got to make sure that we necessitate our value, or we're never going to get voted for again. And then all the while they're lining their pockets with big corporate cash, because that's how they know how to make money. That's what they do. That's what our terrible politicians do, left and right both. And so that's why I say that the ugliness of the coronavirus, it's not that it was purposefully engineered from the beginning. I just think that a lot of things are already in place for a lot of scrupulous, evil people to exploit the situation.
Yeah, I think I quite agree with you on that. I generally try. I generally have the belief that how do I put this? There is that basically China doesn't really care about its larger populace, and so I think,
of course not.
And this isn't something that's necessarily unique to the left in that country either. Like, if you look historically,
no, I mean, going back thousands of years, it's always,
yeah. If you go back to, say, something specific like World War II, for example, the ruling elite of what is now Taiwan, Kuomintang, who are now their right-wing political party, but were previously a monarchical one-party state party up until about the 80s. When they ruled mainland China back during the 1930s, they killed, I believe it was 400,000 to 500,000 people by flooding a large part of China as a means of stopping the Japanese advance. Like, that is a blatant disregard for human life that I don't think, even on its worst day, has ever been seen, like,
in Western nations.
In Western nations, in what, like, perhaps not overall, but in one action. I don't think there's been a single action that has led to 500,000 deaths over the course of 24 hours, if not
Mhm.
for, if not a few days. Like,
Yeah.
even on its worst day, like the Katyn massacre, the Holocaust, the sort of stuff that we look back at and say, yeah, that was not a good time. That stuff took place over. That place either had much smaller numbers or took place over a matter of years rather than days. Like, that is a blatant disregard for human life that is extremely unique to China. and
Well, and not just unique to China. You've seen that in other Asian areas, even in Eastern Eurasia. Because let's not split hairs. There's a lot of ugly things that have happened in Russia similar to that,
yeah,
well before the days of Marxism and the Soviet Union.
yeah. I guess, but I guess it's just this sort of pan-authoritarian idea that, like, obviously, like this is pan-authoritarian idea that the state is meant to be a tool of the people, but ultimately in practice it ends up that people are a tool of the state. And
Yes, and I hope that whatever system that we create going to rectify.
like, because I'm not an ANCAP. I don't believe that there's I don't believe that in practice. Because here's the thing: it's all well and good talking about theory, but you have to
Mhm.
consider how an ideology will work in practice. And
Yes, exactly.
and in theory, I'm not gonna lie. In theory, ANCAPistan sounds lovely. It really does. But
Yeah.
but in
And, well, ideally, so does gay space communism, but that's not feasible either.
but in practice, ANCAPistan would never work because, especially in the current state of things, with the complete moral degeneracy
Yep.
of the modern world, people like Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos would just buy up the entire country, and then
Right.
it would
Are
essentially
you familiar?
it would
Are
just
you very familiar with Star Wars Expanded Universe at all?
yeah, it would essentially just become
If we tried
authoritarian
to
by
implement
proxy.
Capistan now with what we have now going forward, it would basically end up with operations like.
Sorry, could you repeat that last?
I said if we were to implement and Capistan and push for that now with the state of humanity now, we would end up with some corrupt megacorp like Zerka from Star Wars controlling everything.
Yeah, it would essentially be that. Like, it would essentially be a moralless, like, completely like materialist, like a moralist, materialist, no value for human life kind of um, society that essentially goes against the core principles of libertarianism. And I ultimately think this is not just a failing of the ideology itself, but also its proponents, such as I know a lot of people love him, but Hans Hermann Hoppe, for example. I
Mm-hmm.
think as a philosopher, he's a little self-contradictory. For example, like he has a praxeological view on force, saying force is a moral wrong, but yet, well, at the same time, will say that physically removing communists from your society is um,
Yeah, I think that
is necessary.
idealistically, any type of libertarian or Ancapistan type of thinking or philosophy, it has to make concessions with the whole concept of tolerance. Like you can only tolerate people until you have completely intolerant people, then you can no longer tolerate them and you have to remove them, that kind of thing.
Well, that's
So that's
well
that's
that.
the exception. Go ahead, sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to say. That's ultimately my point. I'm saying I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with removing communists from your state if it's absolutely necessary. But at the same time, I don't think it's particularly. I think it's a tad hypocritical if you're going to make a praxeological argument for.
Hmm.
If you're going to make a praxeological argument for saying it's an inherent wrong, but then also say that force is justified if it's against communists, if you like. I think ultimately,
Well,
I think ultimately you
I
need to say
I'm a
something.
little more bloody minded than most people. I think that if you have an ideological group of people who, by definition, by creed, and by action, completely disregard your values, your rights to personhood, your rights to seek property and happiness, I think you are completely morally justified in using state force or personal force to remove those people. So this is where I break with a lot of minarchists and libertarian people, because I definitely think that if you have a radical, violent movement within your otherwise peaceful nation state, like we have with communists and Marxists here in America, I would sleep fine at night knowing that there was some military special ops group that went around black bagging and terminating communist and Marxist activists in my country. I would sleep like a baby at night knowing that happened.
Yeah. See, it's like, here's the thing. I don't actually. Again, I think it's not necessarily the actions itself that I'm against. It's the idea that you would claim that there is an inherent moral wrong in the force, but at the same time, if you use force against these particular types of individuals, then it's okay. Just like,
well, I mean, I'm a naturalist, and being forceful and defending yourself and using intelligence to preemptively destroy someone who wants to destroy you, that is much of a part of nature as eating food and procreating to me.
Oh yeah, it absolutely is. I'm simply saying that if it's part of nature, then you need to acknowledge it as part of nature rather than saying, oh no, it's wrong in all circumstances.
Well, that's not true, because non-consensual sex is nature, and we think, and I agree, but I think that survival is different, because if you have people who are ideologically or for whatever reason driven to want to purposely destroy your society, destroy the way that you make a living, and destroy your nation itself, then you have the right to preemptively act and use lethal force in as responsible and ethical as a way of possible to remove that threat from your land. And like, I don't even want these people killed. I just wish that we could use state force and tax money and everything available to us like charity to say, hey, everybody that wants ridiculous communism and Marxism, we're going to round you guys up and we're going to send you to wherever you want to go. We're going to give you money and we're going to wish you the best on your way. You just can't come back here. This is our place. This is not your place. You don't get to be a Marxist here. You don't get to be a communist here. You get to go elsewhere. Where do you want to go? You want to go to China? Okay, goodbye. You want to go to A, B, and C country where they have this kind of structure? Okay, here's $1,000. Your record's clean here in America. We wish you well. Just don't come back. That's what I wish would happen. I don't want death camps and violence and stuff. I just want to get rid of the element that wants to destroy us.
Oh, that I absolutely agree. I'm simply saying that if you want to make that case, you ought to make a, I guess you could say, an ideological argument that says force is wrong, except rather than making the argument that force is wrong in all circumstances, you make the argument that force is wrong unless it's against unless it's against people that would seek to use force against you regardless, which communists do.
Exactly. Like, for example, I like to use the home. Nation makes a country, which is like a family building a house. If a family builds a nice house, it's by your leave that other people get to come into that house. If they come into your house and they kick over your table and they piss in the corner and they eat your fish over your and tell you that you're a racist piece of shit because you won't feed them and buy them a new toy, you pick them up by the scruff of their neck, you walk them to the edge of your property and say, get out, you piece of shit. You don't get to live here anymore. And there's nothing wrong with people of a country doing that to people who are the equivalent of the spoiled idiot brat in that story. And that's what I think that we should do to these rabble-rousers and people that push for race riots and these Antifa pukes and these Marxist professors. We need to give them an ultimatum and say, if you continue to ascribe this nonsense and push for this nonsense, you are going to be shown the door. You're not going to be executed in a death camp or anything gross or retarded like that, but you are not allowed to live in our house anymore if you're going to keep doing this.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree, but what I think would ultimately happen is that what I think would happen in practice if that was the case is that most people would just stop doing it. Because here's the thing, you can tell, even among the, I guess you could say, the more ideological types, like in the Labour Party or the Democratic Party, is the is that they're not really is that a lot of the people don't really practice what they preach. So I think if you put the pressure on them to either practice what they preach or get out, then they would.
I don't. Here's the problem, though, with Marxists and these communist radicals. You don't want them to practice what they preach, because what they preach is destroying everything around them and destroying our society. I don't want them to do that. I want them to leave.
No, what I mean, sorry, miswording, like saying either get out if they want to practice what they preach, or they can stay and not practice what they preach and what they're currently preaching. Then most of them will want to stay and change their narrative, because again, they're like, while their words might speak one thing, their actions speak another. For example, let's take the Labour Party, for example. Like, one of their main things in the 2019 election was abolishing private schools. Yeah, most of the front bench of the Labour Party that had kids were sending their kids to private school. Because private school is an inherently superior form of education as opposed to public school. It's not a bad thing to admit that. It's just the truth. But and I wouldn't begrudge someone for sending their kids to private school. I certainly think it's superior, like second only to homeschooling. But they're basically, but when they do that, they're basically saying we want to have the superior form of education, but we want to pull the ladder up behind us and make sure no one else can do it. Where under the system that you and I are suggesting, it would be like, no. Either you practice what you preach and send your children to public school, or better yet, leave the country altogether, or you change your narrative and stop preaching for public schools to schools to be abolished, because private schools to be abolished, because everyone should have the opportunity. Everyone should have the chance. I guess not necessarily the opportunity, because that would necessitate redistribution of wealth. But let's say everyone should have. Everyone should, in theory, have the chance. I'm sorry,
I didn't mean to talk over you. I apologize.
Sorry.
We had a bit of lag there. My bad.
Everyone should have the opportunity of sending their kids to private. Everyone should have the opportunity to send their kids to private school if they have the money.
Exactly. Right. I don't like the concept of equality of opportunity is now by centrist, because they still seem to espouse this concept that everyone needs an equal opportunity for higher education, for specialized education. Well, I disagree with that, because that's not in accordance with how our society was built, nor how it flourished and grew to power. I don't think that we should use our values to the point to where it disempowers us and makes us weaker. And this is where I'm in league with the National Socialists, with the modern day Nazi people. They believe that the Third Reich had it correct, and the American Nazis under George Lincoln Rockwell had it correct, when they said we need to stop affirmative action and stop acting like if we give everyone in the world a chance, they're going to be the next Einstein or the next genius or the next great contributor to our culture. We need to let things naturally select for themselves and have our state in accordance to that selection, so we can continue to improve ourselves and make better science and better states and better goals and that kind of thing. So that is one of the things that I do agree with National Socialists on, is that concept, because we've completely lost that in every political camp and every ideological camp I've come across in the modern era. Well, so that's where I agree with the third positionists on that one.
Well, here's the thing: the original third positionist, that being the Italian type, the Italian fascist, as opposed to the German National Socialist.
That stock has a lot of overlap with third positionists.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like saying, the Italian third positionists, they originally weren't actually ethno-nationalists, or at least they weren't to a.
Well, that's because that word didn't exist back then. You realize that phrase has become a boogeyman word to.
No, they weren't quite to the degree as the Nazis were, at least. They had some reservations with the Baltic states, but other than that, Mussolini was quoted saying, "I don't care what race they are, I just care if they're a good fascist."
Right.
But while I vehemently disagree with fascism as an ideology. I do think that
well, I don't like anything that's that authoritarian.
Yeah, I think there's this. I think this idea that people ought to be, I guess you could say, allowed to fit into the. I guess you could say the socio-economic hierarchy wherever they may lay. Wherever they socio-economic hierarchy wherever they may lay, and this idea that we somehow need to engineer society to make sure everyone is on even footing, whether it be at the beginning or the end result, regardless of what it is just wrong, because it's removing agency, autonomy, and self-determination from the individual at the end of the day, whether they be black, white, whatever. And you can make the demographic argument for needing supermajorities in native countries, whether it be the US, UK, whatever. Like, if that's your argument, that's your argument, and I understand that is your argument to a certain degree. But I don't ultimately, even for the people who are in the minority, no matter how big or small that minority is, it's not ideologic. It's not pertinent for the success of a country if you're trying to put minorities on even footing with the majority, if that's not how they appear on the socio-economic strata naturally. People should ultimately be on the socio-economic strata, both as individuals and as quote-unquote collectives. They should be on that economic structure where they sit naturally, not where the government dictates. And I just think...
that's where we get into trouble with people who even that are centrists or right-leaning people that still want to operate within the structures of government we have now, is they believe that they can subvert it, and sort of like I can wield the One Ring and I'll do it correctly. I think that we need to let the horrible governance and the horrible structures we have begin to collapse and then push them until they break. And I'm not a collapsitarian. That's not what I mean by that. But what I mean is we need to expose all of these terrible politicians, left-leaning, so-called right-leaning, which they aren't, these awful, terrible faux conservatives that are just leftists of a different bent, these awful multinational corporations that are in bed with each other, in bed with NGO shit. We need to make these things collapse and drag them through the mud so we can build something better from the wreckage. And I think that we are seeing the start of that, and that's why the cathedral hates Donald Trump, because even though he is not really our friend, and it's because he's a rich, selfish asshole, he is at least a rich, selfish asshole who wants to be loved by the regular masses because he's a TV personality. So we can sort of wield him as a weapon towards the establishment. And that's what we need more of. We need more nationalist, populist personalities gaining prominence in entertainment, in government, in business, so we can actually see the changes implemented that we, the people, actually want to make happen in our countries.
Well, it's like, if you actually look at, Donald Trump, he's more of a foot in the door than anything else, because the thing about Trump is that a lot of the things he says are not technically true. When it comes to the border wall and stuff, they are true, but when he says I'm standing up to China, a lot of the stuff he's actually doing is actually detrimental to the fight against China. But ultimately he is the first step in solving that issue, because he is essentially creating an environment in which people are kind of going, yeah, that China is a problem that we need to deal with, where his, I guess you could say, his ideological successor might go, Trump wasn't exactly he might do things a bit differently from Trump, but which will actually address the issue of China, but by the time he or she actually end up getting in office, they'll have enough people on board who are kind of I guess not necessarily anti-China, but anti-CCP at least, will say, like, oh, that will say that's actually, like, will say, yeah, China is a problem, we need to deal with it, and that will lead into people who actually have better ideas than Trump being able to actually address the issue without being called bigoted or racist or xenophobic or whatever. Not necessarily by the establishment, because they're always going to call them racist and xenophobic, but by the normies, by the general public, so to speak, who, as we've long established, don't speak for the average citizen.
Sorry, I was responding to something in chat. Excuse me. Do you want to address some of the things in chat? Do you want to ask me another question?
I will ask you another question, as we do have quite a lot here.
Excellent.
When did you become interested in politics?
Probably about 20 years ago, shortly after 9/11. The 9/11 debacle. I was young. I was young, and the war that came after that, the Patriot Act, the dramatic change of media, the media lies, the media circus over in the Middle East, all of the mess about Saddam Hussein and weapons of mass destruction. That's when I really started to be concerned with politics, because I saw a new zeitgeist forming around fake news media and media lies to use because the internet was still fairly young and most people weren't avid internet users like they are then. But I could already see how information and idea exchange at an instantaneous worldwide level, that scrupulous people that wanted profit and political power were utilizing that as a weapon against the people of America.
So you basically developed a interest, basically during America's last great paradigm shift before the Trump paradigm shift, so to speak.
Say that one more time. Sorry.
So you developed an interest in politics in the last great paradigm shift preceding the Trump paradigm shift.
Yes.
That paradigm shift.
So I've been trying to learn and keep up with politics and economics and sort of the stage of the world since then.
Yeah. And what would you say were your major developments ideologically pre-Trump?
I learned that most of what I thought about the two major political parties that stood America were false, because they were just two different heads of the same hydra. They were two different heads of the globalist war machine beast that wants to continue cultivating the power that it needs to maintain the U.S. world hegemony and to perpetuate the Keynesian nightmare that we're stuck in. And from that, I have learned how... now, that was where I was before. And since the last 5 or 6 years with the whole Trump thing and the resurgence, leftism, well, not resurgence, but the revelation of how much leftism and endemic globalist nonsense there is in schools and media and stuff, I have learned that I was both right and wrong about the problem. I was right in that these things are all connected, but I was wrong to believe that they aren't. I believe that there's not just one hydra with a lot of heads. There are a lot of facets, a lot of systems in place that are to blame because of Keynesianism, economics, politics, the U.S. global military hegemony, and other things that have led to the plight of Western kind. And that is where I differ now from where I was before the whole Trump era started back in 2014, 2015.
All right. Okay. So, I would say that I was a child of the Trump era, so to speak. Like, I didn't really I didn't really get into politics until after Trump was elected. I would say my advent of political awareness was between Trump becoming president-elect and Trump becoming the actual president. Like, it was in those months, like, in the between, like, November 2016 and, like, January 2017, like, was when I really started deep diving into different political issues and forming, like, political opinions of my own. And so I think that maybe, well, you were having I guess you could say, a paradigm shift or learning new stuff. That was when I was just about, I guess you could say, finding my feet in politics. Like, I had been listening to, like, the likes of Sargon and Steven Crowder for about a year or so before that, but it was only when that stuff really started that it was only when Trump got elected that I kind of realised that, like, he, like, rather than just being what the media portrayed him as, he was more of a good than a bad, so to speak. Okay, I am going to have to, like, I deeply apologise. I've never done this on stream before, but I am going to have to step away from a moment.
Sure.
I hate to do this to you, Yizz, but if you would like to respond to any questions that they have in the chat,
Sure.
I would.
You just want to mute yourself and step away for a minute and me take the reins?
Yeah, I will I'll be back
Sure.
as quickly as I can. I'm really sorry. Otherwise,
That's fine.
Right. Sorry, guys. I'll be back in a moment. Thanks, you.
Yeah, no problem. I'll go ahead and directly address the question as to whether I'm a eunuch or not. I use the phrase eunuch because I don't like LGBT words like trans person or trans woman or trans femme or anything like that. I don't like being associated with any of that. I claimed the word eunuch because no one else was using it that I could find in the public sphere. It's a cool old word that has meant a lot of different things in history, in the Bible, in the Roman Empire, and Greece, and all kinds of other stuff. I just thought it was an interesting word, and oftentimes eunuchs were guardians, they were philosophers or counselors to important people, and I thought it had sort of an interesting historic ring to it. And since I am more male than female genetically, I'm XXY, and I had to have my mutant gonads removed. Technically, I guess you could call me a eunuch, so that's why I chose that word to as my public name. So I hope that answers that. Earlier in the chat, Reconquista UK, you said that you always thought that I had two brains, one to keep up with conversation and another to text chat at lightning speed. Were you mocking me because I asked BK to repeat something, or were you complimenting me because I can do chat and talk at the same time? I'm just curious. I'll give you time to respond in chat there. I'm going to talk now to Inconvenient. I'm glad that you have realized that people can have serious conversations about certain values that national, while still rejecting the ugliness and the authoritarianism that the Third Reich in Germany led to. In America especially, there were people that, for some silly reason, decided to call themselves the American Nazi Party, which I thought was completely ridiculous. That did have some very good ideas of governance and how to implement science and rationality into the way that we governed with policy. But of course, they called themselves Nazis, so they were demonized and went nowhere. But there are a few good ideas in the NatSoc cluster. And like I always say about systems of government going forward, I don't think that we should try to bring back any system that used to exist. I think that we should take what worked and what was good of all previous systems and look at what failed and what was bad of all previous systems and build something new going forward for the modern era that incorporates good ideas into new, better ideas while eschewing the things that led to bad problems from the past. Well, thank you very much, Reconquista UK. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Hello.
And thank you,
I'm back.
Thank you, Tranquility Base. I appreciate that. And I appreciate the love I'm getting from the chat from.
Yeah, fantastic chat. Well, thank you for keeping us entertained while I was gone, and I appreciate you all cooperating with my desire to step away for just a moment. Okay, so we're about an hour and 40 in, so I'll ask a couple more questions, and then, considering just how long we've been going, I will wrap this up. Is that all right with you?
Certainly. That's fine with me. That's just fine. And since we're talking about wrapping up, I would encourage you to come join me over on Jason Kuna's No White Guilt channel after this, if you would like to learn more about what I mean when I talk about the anti-white narrative and breaking the onus of white guilt on Western kind. We have an excellent community stream that lasts for many hours on Sunday night, which started about half an hour ago. So that is where I'll be headed after this, and you're welcome to come join me over there. So go ahead. Let's ask me some more questions, BK.
Okay. What areas of social science are you most knowledgeable in? Political science, philosophy, economics, anthropology, etc.
I am not classically educated in any way. I've had to be completely... I cannot tell you the names of authors. I can't name authors and say, so-and-so said this, so-and-so. I am not good at that at all, and I've never been good at that at all. I would say, however, outside of education, what I am knowledgeable about, I am probably more knowledgeable about ethics, philosophy, and spirituality more than anything else. And then that's a social science. And then hard sciences are probably what I'm most invested in. Everything from biology, evolution, IQ, neurology, and then more wiggly kinds of science like psychology, that kind of thing. That's what I've spent most of my life really caring about and learning about on my.
All right. So you would say that you were perhaps. So like you would say that you're perhaps more of a self-learned individual. Like a lot of what you've learned.
Yes, I'm definitely autodidactic. I've not had proper training.
Yeah, I would say I'm very much the same. In fact, my field of educational study is not even related to politics at all. It's actually computer science, where but I have become as my interest has increased. I would say I've become increasingly self-taught through with the help of expertise from people who are at least partially educated in such areas, like the academic agent and like others who have been willing to essentially give me recommendations on who to read and why and what information they'll give me. And I think I have over time amassed a knowledge through I guess you could say, the great works of men far more educated than I on subjects that I do take a keen interest in, even if I have not been formally educated on the matter. But considering the current state of the
union, I definitely could say the same. I've learned from academic agents, the other big names back like Peterson and Sam Harris and Stefan Molyneux. I've been listening to men like that for 10 or 12 years. I do my best to absorb while I work. Like my trade jobs have been nursing and professional driving, so I have a lot of time to just listen to stuff while I'm doing other things, and that's how I've sort of absorbed the last decade of information to get to where I am.
Yeah, I would say there's definitely a when it comes to all YouTubers, there's definitely an element of self-education that comes with it, especially in the political sphere, because you can't, because you do need to know what you're talking about, and there's no other way to do that than to consult the experts on the matter, which kind of leads you down the road to not only reading the stuff that you necessarily agree with, but the stuff that you vehemently disagree with. Like, I've read Gentile, I've read Evola, I've read the Communist Manifesto, like Engels and Marx, and of course I've read stuff like Hayek, Mises, like stuff. Chomsky. Generally,
I don't read much because I have trouble reading long form text. I have ADHD. I don't take medicine for, so it's hard to read. So I listen to things that are audibly spoken and like books on tape, because you can find lots of Hop and Mises and Sowell on YouTube. So I listen to them instead of read them.
Yeah, but but ultimately, the sentiment is the same. It's like self-education for this type of this corner of YouTube is very important, and I do think that if we're going to bring about the change that we want to bring about, then we not only need to be educated, even if only self-educated in the areas through which we advocate, but also the areas for which we seek to refute. Which is why I would recommend everyone read. I would recommend everyone read Essays on Fascism, which is essentially a collection of the main fascist works, such as what's it called again? The the Doctrine of Fascism, as well as
I've never read that.
As well as Doctrine. I would recommend it all read it, not necessarily because I believe in it or anything like that, but just like I'm actually vehemently against it, but because I think if people are more educated on what they are against, then they have a better chance of refuting it because they actually know what they're talking about. And you'll often find that a lot of totalitarians are actually less educated than, once you've read the text, you actually find that a lot of even the more a lot of the more vehement totalitarians are less educated than you on their own ideology. So
yeah, that was the case back when I used to argue with religious people about Islam versus Christianity, Judaism. I found that my delve into the matter often proved that I knew more about people's religions than they did.
Yeah, that's also something that you ought to do. Read the Bible, the Torah, and Quran. Once you've read all three, you'll be able to compare and contrast the three, and you'll be able to make a proper assessment about what's good and what's bad about all three, with a rather unbiased opinion. Now, what Bible you read is ultimately up to you. You can read a Catholic or a Protestant version. I personally read the Protestant version, as I am a Protestant myself. But if you choose to read the Catholic version,
my favorite is the King James version because it sounds old timey and it's Protestant and it sounds really nice. I like the King James.
Yeah, that's what I read as well. But ultimately, if you choose to read the Catholic Bible, it's not really much different. It's just the language is perhaps a tad. The translations and I guess you could say the contextual language is slightly different. But overall, you will be able to get the same sense of what is different and what is different, what's the same, and how you can compare and contrast the three major Abrahamic religions, as opposed to both like atheism and paganism and other. I guess you could say, and the belief systems, and you can make your own. You can make your own cost-benefit analysis as to how useful these spiritual texts are in the grand scheme of the world. I personally am an Anglican Protestant. I believe in God. I am a God-fearing person. I have not, being a young person, I have not found the time to go to church, but I do intend on going when I do intend on going to my local.
I'm a Christian ally, and I jokingly say I'm ethnic Christian because I grew up that way. It's my culture, it's part of my family, it's part of everything I've been involved in. But I guess technically I'm an atheist. I can't feel faith. I've never been able to feel or interpret the mystical or magical side of any type of religion. But I do value Christianity, and I am on Team Christian when it comes to religious identity and religious importance of the West. So I will put on my cross tabard and Deus Vult with you if the time comes, my friend.
I guess I guess with me it helped that I grew up with a Catholic family because my family are of Irish descent. Well, Irish and slight Portuguese descent, but so very Catholic. But at the same, I chose to convert to Anglican Protestantism because not only does it make more sense to me, but also because it is culturally part of my national heritage. But it's also it's something that people think, oh, converting to, like, devoting yourself to religion, even in a, I guess you could say, a more modern, I guess you could, even in a more modern, like, sort of loose interpretation sort of way, it's really difficult, and you don't. It's not difficult. It's about holding a certain faith in something that's not necessarily tangible. It's about it's. I guess you could say it's a lesson in believing in something, as opposed to as opposed to seeking hard evidence. Like, I do think there is a certain mental health in not necessarily seeking evidence in everything, in seeking hard evidence in everything, but just choosing to place your faith in something, especially when the lessons it teaches, which I believe in Christian teachings do teach more good things than bad things, though it certainly isn't without fault. I do think when placing your faith in something that does teach more bad than good is ultimately a good thing for society, especially if it can be a binding moral especially it can be a binding moral factor both on the local and national level.
I'm more analytical than you. I'm again scientific. I believe that there is Christians, especially colloquially in the United States, say that there is a God-shaped hole in everyone's heart. There is scientific value in that. I believe that there is a spiritual desire to have larger meaning and connectivity to the things around you, to the natural world, and to the people beyond you that have yet to exist. And I think that we should not seek to tear down the religious institutions that nurture that very important human trait unless we have something better to offer. So that's sort of why I'm on the team Christian right now. Is it works, it's good, it's led to the values we have now, which are good. So I believe we should not seek to destroy it or remove it unless there is something noticeably better that evolves naturally in our society over time.
Yeah. And Bury Bassett, yes, Zoroastrianism was a precursor to Christianity. It was a Christianity is I guess you could see it as a combination of both Zoroastrianism, which was the first monotheistic religion, and Judaism, which is where a lot of Christian beliefs come from. Zoroastrianism goes back to I guess you could say the Sumerian, Mesopotamian sort of era of belief, and it was the only belief of that area which had one god as opposed to multiple. So yes, Zoroastrianism does have a loose not a direct connection like Judaism, but a loose connection to Christianity. Yes, and it was also.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
It also was where the concept of a single unearthly antagonist such as the devil came from, because in Judaism the concept of the devil doesn't actually exist. The words I believe it's the word Satan in Hebrew just means antagonist, so it can be applied to anyone.
And the word hell simply means the removal from paradise, or separation from the God state, or what Christians would call heaven.
Yeah.
So, have you other questions, Bridgekeeper? I'm not afraid.
I'll ask you one more, and then, considering we've been going nearly 2 hours, we'll call it a day.
Fair enough.
To what political ideology do you most closely hold, if anything at all?
That's a question that I don't feel comfortable answering. The closest thing that I ascribe to doesn't exist, and it's almost laughable if I say what it is.
That's fair enough. You don't have to answer if you're not comfortable, but...
Well, I shouldn't say I'm not comfortable. I should say... people might laugh at me, but I think that the most... I don't ascribe to any realistic model, because I think they're all flawed and terrible and need to be rebuilt. I think that we need something better, but I would want a mix of Heinlein's Libertopia uh, mixed with the United Federation of Planets from Star Trek. And I know that people are going to laugh at me, but Star Trek is not communist. Star Trek is not socialist. Star Trek is a post-scarcity libertarian utopia. And I think we should aim for something that is functional like Heinlein's Libertopia, borrowing from the realistic models of all of the structures of government that have come before us, cherry-picking what is best to work towards some type of post-scarcity scientific elevation goal. And that's one of the things that I like the shine of Nazism about, is the philosophical thinkers that led to National Socialists. They were people like me. They weren't racial purists. They were people that said, hey, we don't like what we believe has led to the flaws of society, which is genetics, which is degeneracy. We need to encourage a way to use science and people's humanity to build better humans, to build better futures. And I think there's value in that. And I think that many science fiction tropes expand upon that without having all of the ugly racial violence and jingoism that went along with what gets called Nazism these days. So if I suppose the best way that I could wrap it up is to say Heinlein Libertopia plus Star Trek United Federation of Planets with the stepping stones of sort of what we have now in America, with less invasive government programs and a more holistic social push towards science paired with human evolution.
Well, I would agree with you. Also, there was the I think there's something to be said about moving to a more, I guess you could say, a post-scarcity society where people essentially want for nothing because the essentials are all taken care of via there being an infinite amount of it.
Mm-hmm.
But and I also think the kind of freedom of association problem will become less and less of an issue as interplanetary travel becomes possible. Because obviously, if the people you don't like are quite literally a world away, it's not going to be an issue, is it? But I think that a lot of the social issues that plague us today, outside of, I guess you could say, ideological possession, which will forever be a problem, I think a lot of the problems that plague us today will become far less of an issue when society progresses past the borders of this little blue and green rock we call home.
Yeah, it will one day, friend, but I'd like us to get there, and I would like Western kind to not have gone extinct by that point, because I think that Western kind are the ones who will lead us to the stars, because no one else seems like they're capable or willing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like, as a libertarian, I am perfectly comfortable with saying West is best. Like,
yes, me too.
Like, here's the thing, like, West is best. Japan's good, Korea's pretty good, but West is best. And that's not to mention that a lot of the best Asian countries have a lot of Western inspiration. Like,
yes, definitely.
Through interaction with Western powers. So, like, even then, West is still best.
Yes. Well, that was a beautiful thing to wrap up on. I sent you a link that I would like you to share.
I absolutely will share it.
It's the link to Jason Kuna's No White Guilt he does every Sunday that I'm usually a part of. It actually usually doesn't start till right now, but they started early because they have an Australian guest on tonight. So if you'll share that link in chat for me, I shared it broken up earlier, but you'll actually be able to share it where you can link it. If you would like to come over there, that community is called the White Positive Sphere. We are the people who care about white well-being. We care about the success of Western kind, and we are not about Wignats and Nazi flags and all that other Fed posting garbage. We do not believe that the way forward for white people is in the past. We believe the way forward is something new that we build. And to do that, we have to break the onus of white guilt, and we have to be willing to unify and have an ethnic cultural identity of Western kind. So instead of saying, white is right or any kind of white pride, white power nonsense, the phrase that we use is aligning to the archetype of Western kind, because anyone of any creed can see the value of Western kind in what we've built, and anyone of any race can align with that archetype and align with our values and help us reach the stars. So if you would like to know more about that community, please join me over there. And any Sunday night, you can come over to No White Guilt stream and learn from us what we're all about. So, and of course, please follow and subscribe to me. My links are in the description. You'll see that I'm Yizz the Eunuch on all social media. I'm on Parler, Gab, Minds, Telegram, everything. And my links to Twitter and YouTube are, of course, in the description there. Please join me. And if you like Star Trek, I recently made a good Eunuch Corner Club diatribe about the value of ethnocentrism as described by the science fiction Star Trek, because they value cultural variance and cultural actual diversity, not this homogenized evil diversity that gets preached these days. So it's a very interesting video. We've had a lot of Star Trek talk today, so definitely check out that video of mine. You'll have a good time with it. Okay. And I'll pass it back to you, BK. Go ahead.
Fantastic. So, if you would like to follow me on Twitter, you can do so at Night of Britain. If you wish to become a monthly patron, you can do so at subscribestar.com/British Crusader. If you wish to get early access to my videos, you can do so at onlyfans.com/Night of Britain. Yes, I know, it's very funny. You can donate to me one time at paypal.me/Night of Britain, and you can support the stream, and you can support the stream at streamlabs.com/BritishKnight/tip. You can follow me at Twitter at Night of Britain. As Yizz said, her links are in the description if you wish to do so. My next video is going to be on the history of gun ownership in the United Kingdom. That will be out within the next few days. I'm off work for the next couple of days, so I'm going to be working hard at getting that out for you as soon as possible. This has been Exploring the Politisphere. I've been the British Knight. Our guest for this evening has been Yizz the Eunuch. Thank you for watching, everyone. Have an excellent day.